A baby was about to be buried when something incredible happened. The father held her tiny hands for a final goodbye, but as if by a miracle, he felt them move. At first he thought it was an illusion, but what happened next left everyone in shock. James, a devastated father, was about to bury his little daughter, a baby, just 10 months old, that cold morning, surrounded by family and friends. He was caught between profound grief and disbelief. It felt as though his world had been ripped from his hands, leaving him adrift as he looked at his daughter Olivia's small body in the tiny white coffin, so small it hardly seemed real. The room was steeped in heavy silence, broken only by muffled sobs and quiet whispers. Emily, the baby's mother, wept with a sorrowful cry that sounded like a lament as she gazed at her daughter's peaceful face. It felt impossible to believe this moment was real. She gently stroked the baby's little hand, trying to imprint the memory of her soft skin and those tiny fingers that would no longer grip hers with the same energy. James stood beside Emily, staring intently at their daughter, desperately trying to find some peace in the moment. Memories of her laughter, her first attempts at words, and her small milestones flooded his mind with painful clarity. She had been a ray of light in their lives, a vibrant presence that filled every corner of their home with joy and energy. Now standing before her lifeless body, James was desperately searching for an explanation, a reason for the tragedy they were enduring. But as the minutes passed, something began to change. Some of those who approached to say their final goodbyes stepped back, slightly. Visibly puzzled murmurs began to rise among the mourners, and curious glances were exchanged, reflecting growing unease. It was then that a close family aunt, after touching the baby's face, turned to James and hesitantly murmured, She feels a little warm. Don't you think?" James tried to dismiss the comment, but assuming it was just residual body heat or an illusion caused by the overwhelming grief everyone felt, he sighed deeply and responded in a low, trembling voice that must be normal. "Aunt, it hasn't been that long since He couldn't finish the sentence. The words felt like stones in his mouth. Even so, his own words felt hollow. The faces around him started to reflect growing doubt, and James felt a rising pressure in his chest, a sudden wave of uncertainty that took hold of his mind. He glanced at Emily, whose eyes were now wide open. She also seemed to question what they were experiencing. Emily stepped forward, breathing heavily, and placed her trembling hand on the baby's forehead, as if afraid to confirm what her mind refused to believe. "James," Emily murmured, her voice faltering and her eyes brimming with tears. "Aunt Sarah is right. Olivia is still warm. I don't think she should be." James shook his head, clinging to any rational explanation that could keep him grounded in the world he knew, but it was futile. What had started as a faint echo of uncertainty had turned into a sharp doubt piercing his mind. He turned his gaze back to little Olivia, scrutinizing her still body, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that the warmth might mean something more than an illusion. But she remained motionless, her delicate features as serene as if she were resting in a deep, eternal sleep. The room was wrapped in tense silence, broken only by whispers and the soft shuffle of footsteps from those moving nearby. James took a deep breath and said in a voice that tried to sound logical but was heavy with doubt, "I think it could be because of the room's temperature." His voice was shaky, lacking the firmness he hoped to convey. Yet the doubt hung in the air like an uncomfortable shadow, a thought no one dared to fully express, but everyone felt the family was saying their final goodbyes, and there were only a few minutes left before the coffin would be closed, and Olivia would be taken to the cemetery. Time seemed to move at its own pace. Hastening the inevitable moment, Emily kept her gaze fixed on her daughter with a mixture of pain and a silent hope she couldn't explain the warmth they had felt, which could earlier be dismissed as a result of desperation, and heightened emotions now lingered in their minds as an unanswered question. James, feeling the urgency of one last connection, knelt on the floor, holding his daughter's tiny hand. It was a farewell, a touch laden with all the unspoken words, with the love that would remain even after the earth covered that small white coffin. He ran his fingers over the delicate contours of Olivia's hand, feeling the softness he knew so well, and then, like a miracle, an unexpected sensation sent a shiver down his spine, leaving him frozen in place. A slight squeeze, almost imperceptible, as if Olivia's tiny hand had moved. He blinked several times, confused, trying to process what he felt. "This can't be." He thought, "It's all in my mind." But the sensation repeated itself, this time slightly firmer, as if his daughter were clinging to life, refusing to leave those who loved her so deeply. James's heart raced, pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. It felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs, and with a mixture of fear and hope, he whispered to Emily, "Emily, she squeezing my hand." Emily looked at him stunned, Trying to grasp what it could mean, her face lit up with a mix of disbelief and wonder. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, as if everyone was suspended in that strange and nearly impossible possibility. Time froze, and the silence was broken only by the frantic beating of James's heart. Emily, breathing heavily and trembling, reached out toward the baby's other hand. Her touch was filled with an expectation that was almost unbearable. However, the tiny hand remained motionless under her fingers. The warmth was still there, defying what they knew, but there was no movement. Emily looked up at James, and a tear slid down her cheek, mingling with an expression of pain and confusion. James, though, I don't feel anything, she murmured, her voice breaking under the weight of despair. Other relatives, alerted by what they had overheard, approached, reaching out to touch the baby's skin. Murmurs and soft exclamations began to spread through the room as family and friends touched the small body, their perplexed expressions attempting to confirm what James had felt. "Are you sure you felt her move?" James asked an uncle in a low, tense voice, reflecting the doubt that was spreading among everyone. James, still in shock, felt certainty coursing through his VS, the only tangible truth amidst the chaos. "Yes, I'm sure it wasn't my imagination. I felt her squeeze my hand," he replied in a grave, firm voice, laden with emotion. As the murmurs grew louder among the relatives, Emily grabbed Omar's arm tightly, fear and hope battling within her. "James, that's not possible. You must be imagining it," she insisted, her voice desperately trying to cling to reason amidst the emotional chaos. But James's expression said otherwise. There was a conviction in his eyes that could not be ignored. That moment of doubt quickly transformed into a desperate decision. They needed someone to assess what was happening. They couldn't riz solely on their perceptions clouded by grief. It was an urgency felt in every gesture, a need for answers that no one there could provide. James called his friend Ethan, a man of medium height with sharp, attentive eyes. One of the closest family members, he asked him to seek help. Ethan's, noticing the gravity of the situation and the couple's state of shock, didn't hesitate for a second. He ran out, crossing the street with quick, frantic steps to the nearest pharmacy. There, the pharmacist on duty, Mr. David, a man in his 50s with a tired expression, was organizing shelves. "David, you have to come now." Undressed, exclaimed out of breath, his words filled with urgency and desperation. "It's James's daughter, the baby. Something's very wrong. She might be alive." The pharmacist raised his eyebrows, pausing for a moment as he processed Andre's words. The customers in the pharmacy who had overheard the start of the conversation fell silent, exchanging glances that ranged from astonishment to disbelief. What David muttered, frowning. "What do you mean? Are you sure?" he asked, looking at Andy's with a mix of disbelief and concern. "They felt her move. Her skin isn't cold like it should be. You have to come now." Ethan's insisted, his gaze pleading for action. Without asking further questions, David quickly grabbed his stethoscope and a portable monitor. His fingers trembled slightly as he gathered the equipment. Although he had faced emergencies before, he had never experienced anything like this. His mind was a whirlwind of questions as he tried to remain calm. Following undress to the funeral hall, the short walk felt interminable, each step weighed down by the overwhelming responsibility and expectation pressing on his shoulders. When they arrived, the murmurs among the relatives grew louder, spreading like wildfire. All eyes turned to Euro, their gazes filled with restrained hope and disbelief. "Could it have been a medical error?" whispered an elderly aunt, clutching a handkerchief to her chest. "Can you imagine burying her alive?" murmured a cousin, his face pale and full of horror. Euro felt the air in the room grow heavy. Every face around him reflected a tension he had never experienced in his entire career. He approached James and Emily, who looked at him with a mix of pleading and desperation. Without saying a word, David began his assessment, struggling to control his own rapid, uneven breathing. "Please, I need silence," David said, his voice attempting to sound firm but trembling slightly. The room fell into a tense silence for a moment, though the expectation was palpable. David placed his hand on the baby's chest, feeling the warmth that shouldn't have been there. His brow furrowed as he carefully positioned the stethoscope. For a moment, he thought he heard something, a faint sound like the distant echo of a drum, then silence. He tried again, adjusting the stethoscope position, but uncertainty gripped him once more. "This can't be," he murmured to himself, a chill running down his spine. Could he be imagining things? Was his mind playing tricks on him under the pressure of the suffocating atmosphere in the room? The murmurs began to rise again, and David, sensing that the agitation was affecting his focus, raised his hand. "I need everyone to leave right now," he said, his voice resonating through the room. "Leave?" someone asked incredulously, but David insisted. "I need absolute silence to evaluate the baby." His request was met with surprise and reluctance. Worried glances were exchanged, but gradually the room began to clear. The murmurs turned into heavy footsteps and stifled sighs as the family stepped away. "I can't believe this is happening," muttered an uncle, his voice cracking with emotion. Once the door closed, the room was enveloped in an almost unreal silence. David leaned over the baby again. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed amplified, marking time like a countdown. He placed the stethoscope on Olivia's tiny chest once more, this time with greater precision. Then he heard a faint, irregular sound, like a distant drum beat, an almost imperceptible echo. Suddenly the sound stopped, leaving David with a sinking feeling. He straightened slowly, his eyes filled with doubt, but also a seriousness that kept everyone on edge. He knew he couldn't make the next decision alone. "I'm going to call the fire department. This is more serious than I imagined," he said without revealing any conclusions. The tension in the room was like a taut rope on the verge of snapping. The relatives waiting outside remained silent, clinging to the hope of a miracle, or the fear of confronting another devastating disappointment. James and Emily exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting a mix of hope and terror. It was a moment where everything could change, yet every possibility felt like staring into an abyss of uncertainty. Emily gripped James's hand tightly, seeking some kind of reassurance, though neither could offer any certainty. In a voice barely audible, as if speaking to herself, Emily asked James, what if our little girl is still alive?" The doubt pierced her heart like a dagger tearing apart the fragile rationality she was desperately trying to hold on to. James's face was pale, but he couldn't suppress the growing hope, even as his mind warned him that this might be nothing more than a cruel illusion. Finally, the sound of a fire truck siren shattered the oppressive silence in the room. A group of firefighters entered quickly, their expressions serious and their eyes focused. The leader, a man with a firm demeanor and a calm but commanding presence, approached James and Emily with a slight nod of his head. His face reflected empathy, as if he understood the magnitude of what this moment meant for them. Wasting no time, he began to organize the necessary equipment to assess the baby's condition. The parents watched every movement with their hearts clenched and their hands trembling. The firefighter, with steady but careful hands, picked up a pulse oximeter and attempted to place it on the baby's tin foot. The task wasn't easy. Her foot was so small and delicate that he had to adjust the device several times. Initially, there was no response. James felt a stab of disappointment mixed with paralyzing fear. But before he could react, the firefighter adjusted the device again and checked carefully. The tension in the room was palpable, and each second seemed to stretch endlessly. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the small screen on the oximeter began to display numbers. First, the oxygen saturation 84%, then the heart rate 66 beats per minute. A murmur of surprise and disbelief rippled through the room. People exchanged looks, unable to process what they were seeing. James and Emily stared at each other, wide-eyed and speechless. The hope they had buried alongside the certainty of death began to stir in their hearts, though it was accompanied by the fear of what this could mean. The firefighter, frowning in concentration, stared at the numbers on the screen, searching for any error or malfunction in the device. "It's really showing signs of life," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. He adjusted the oximeter again to confirm its accuracy. The atmosphere in the room shifted rapidly from expectant silence to a barely contained stir of activity. The murmurs among the relatives began to grow. "She's alive," someone whispered, their voice trembling with astonishment and hope. "How can this be? What if they had buried her like this?" Another remarked, their eyes bright with disbelief. The firefighter, now more serious, turned to James and Emily. His words carried the urgency of the moment. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately," he announced firmly, already focused on the next steps. As he spoke, the numbers on the small oximeter screen fluctuated, underscoring the gravity of the situation. What had begun as a funeral had transformed into a whirlwind of emotions. Emily covered her mouth with her hands, unable to hold back the tears streaming down her face. James, on the other hand, felt a storm form of conflicting emotions welling up in his chest. Relief, disbelief, and a growing sense of urgency. How could the hospital have declared his daughter dead if she still had vital signs? It was as though the impossible were unfolding before them, defying all logic. With his heart pounding, James tightly held Emily's hand as they watched the firefighters prepare to transport their baby. The atmosphere was almost unbearable. The mix of hope and anguish filled every corner of the room. When the firefighters lifted the small coffin to carry it to the ambulance, James and Emily instinctively followed, determined to protect their daughter. They rushed to the back of the ambulance, ready to climb inside. However, one of the officers abruptly stopped them. "I'm sorry, but you can't come inside. You'll need to follow us in a car and wait at the hospital," he said firmly. What do you mean we can't come?" James exclaimed, his voice desperate, almost a shout. "She's our daughter, we have to be with her," he added, his tone full of anguish. Emily, her eyes brimming with tears, shook her head in disbelief. "Please, we can't leave her alone," she pleaded, her voice breaking. The faces of their relatives mirrored the same indignation and fear. James's mother stepped forward, grabbing one of the firefighter's arms. "They have the right to be with their daughter," she exclaimed, her voice choked with a mix of anger and panic. But the urgency of the moment left no room for arguments. The firefighters shut the ambulance doors with a loud thud, the sound echoing in the courtyard like a final note. Within seconds, the vehicle sped off with its siren wailing, leaving the family paralyzed and distraught. James and Emily looked at each other in panic. They didn't even have a car to follow the ambulance. "I'll take you," shouted Ethan, waving his hand for them to get into his car in a hurry. Everyone piled into the vehicle. The engine roared as Andre sped off, determined not to lose sight of the ambulance inside the car. The silence was broken only by Emily's short, frantic breaths as she stared out the window. Without really seeing anything, her thoughts swirled uncontrollably. They had almost buried their daughter alive. The mere idea was so terrifying she could barely breathe. How could the doctors have declared Olivia dead without realizing she was still alive? What was supposed to be a farewell had turned into an unimaginable nightmare. James closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the situation crushing him. Every beat of his heart seemed to scream the injustice of what was happening. The thought of his daughter being alone in the ambulance surrounded by strange D was almost unbearable. Doubt seeped into his mind like poison. If the doctors had been wrong in declaring her dead, what else could they have gotten wrong? Everything seemed disconnected from logic, wrapped in a mystery no one could explain. "We almost buried her, Emily." James whispered, his voice breaking with anguish. How could this have happened? Emily turned to him, her face marked by pain and helplessness. Silent tears slid down her cheeks, reflecting the fear and confusion of losing her daughter for a second time. This time perhaps definitively. Why weren't they allowed to be with her? The hospital, which should have been a place of refuge and clarity now, felt like a labyrinth of doubts and evasions as the car sped through the streets toward the hospital. Their thoughts narrowed to a single goal: for everything to end. Well, for Mia to return home with them safe and sound. But the shadow of uncertainty hung in the air, making every second feel like an eternity. They arrived shortly after the ambulance. The scene was one of pure tension. Doctors and nurses rushed around the emergency room, their voices blending into hurried instructions. James and Emily stumbled out of the car, propelled by the instinct to stay close to their daughter. They hurried toward the emergency entrance. Emily, her voice trembling and her eyes filled with tears, spoke where the baby's parents. "Please, we need to be with her." A doctor, in a white coat, his expression grave, turned to them. His furrowed brow revealed a mix of surprise and concern. "I'm sorry, but you can't go in right now," he said, his tone serious. "This is a critical situation. We're taking her straight to the emergency room. You'll need to wait here." The response hit Emily like a knife, making her stack. James held her tightly, his eyes fixed on the door closing before them, taking their daughter into a space where they couldn't follow. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. All the warmth and hope they had felt moments before turned into a cold desolation that seemed to consume their souls. As the small stretcher carrying the tiny white coffin was wheeled through the hospital corridors, the contrast between the coffin and the urgency of the medical staff created a surreal atmosphere in the waiting area. Patients and companions who'd been sitting quietly turned to look, their faces shifting from fatigue to astonishment and horror. "Did you see that it's a coffin?" with someone murmured, leaving the sentence unfinished, caught in the shock. "What could have happened? Did the baby come back to life?" whispered an elderly woman, her eyes filled with compassion. Inside the hospital, the corridor where James and Emily waited was cold and sterile, illuminated by white lights that flickered slightly. The atmosphere emphasized the emptiness in their hearts. Sitting side by side, still dressed in mourning, they remained silent, their hands intertwined like an anchor in the storm. Neither had the courage to let go. The silence in the hallway was deafening, amplifying the anguish they felt. James tried to comfort Emily, but his own heart pounded wildly, hammering in his chest. Like an out-of-control drum, anxiety consumed him, making each breath an effort. In a moment of silent desperation, he turned his gaze to the small window in the hallway beyond the glass. He searched the sky for some divine answer, a sign that something good could emerge from the chaos. The uncertainty gwed at James. He didn't know if what was happening was a developing miracle or a grotesque medical mistake. But one thing was certain: he wouldn't rest until he found the truth in the oppressive silence of the hospital. His thoughts drifted to the last moments he had shared with his daughter, memories now intertwined with the harrowing fear of the current situation. What had once been days of laughter and small surprises had turned into a spiral of horror. He could never have imagined it had all started just 3 days ago. in a way so ordinary it seemed harmless. Olivia, their baby, had shown the first signs of discomfort, persistent crying, and a mild fever. Emily, worried but optimistic, thought it was something minor, perhaps a small cold or colic. Common problems in babies, however, that night. Olivia's crying changed. It was his or more tired, echoing through the house with the distress that tore at her parents' hearts. She squirmed, kicking her little legs as if something were deeply troubling her with the break of dawn. James and Emily knew they couldn't wait any longer. They decided to take Mia to the hospital upon arriving. They were met with a disheartening scene, an overcrowded, chaotic waiting room filled with an air of despair. James vividly remembered the helplessness of that morning, the endless hours they spent waiting for care as Olivia's fever climbed, cled higher and higher. Her small face was alarmingly flushed. "I've been here since dawn, and nothing," an older woman commented, an AWAR voice worn out from the wait. "I walked past the pediatrician's office and he was just sitting there on his phone. It's shameful," she added, her tone heavy with indignation. That comment ignited fury in James and Emily. They looked at the closed office door, then at the reception desk where an employee was focused on her paperwork without so much as glancing up. Outraged, they approached the desk. "Miss, our daughter has had a high fever for hours. Could you please ask the doctor to see her?" Emily pleaded, her voice trembling with worry and exhaustion. The receptionist, her gaze distant, responded emotionlessly, "I've already informed the doctor. You'll need to wait." Wait. That word echoed like a cruel sentence. 2 hours had passed since their arrival, and Olivia's condition was visibly worsening. James's heart sank each time he looked at his daughter curled up in his arms, lacking the energy that used to light up her little face. Finally, they were called in, exhausted but trying to remain composed. They entered the consultation room. The first thing they noticed was the doctor's indifference. He didn't even lift his eyes from his phone. James felt his blood boil, but held back. They needed his help, whether they liked it or not. "What's the problem?" the doctor asked. Flatly, without looking away from the screen, Emily quickly explained Olivia's symptoms: the crying, the rising fever. The doctor nodded mechanically, as if he were hearing a shopping list, and began asking questions Emily had already answered. It was clear he wasn't paying attention without properly examining Mia. He prescribed a medication and began writing the prescription. "Give her this. It'll lower the fever and ease her discomfort," he said, returning his gaze to his phone. Emily, incredulous, couldn't hold back. "Aren't you even going to examine her?" she asked, her voice low but charged with restrained fury. The doctor sighed as if the effort were monumental, with evident disinterest. He coolly listened to Olivia's lungs, a so-called examination that lasted mere seconds. Then, stepping back, he said dismissively, "It's just a mild cold. I didn't even need to check her." "I already knew," he smirked ironically. "You can go home." The entire consultation lasted less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes of negligence after nearly 3 hours of waiting. James and Emily left the office feeling a mix of rage and helplessness. They knew something was wrong but felt they had few options. They returned home clinging to the hope that the medication would work. That hope, however, was short-lived. Hours later, Olivia began having difficulty breathing. Her tiny lungs struggled for every breath, and her lips turned a bluish hue that sent chills down her parents' spines. Panic seized them. With terror in their eyes and trembling hands, they wrapped Mia in a blanket and rushed back to the hospital. The journey had never felt so long or so fraught with obstacles as it did that night when they arrived at the hospital again. The chaos still hung in the air. The groans of patients, the coughing, and the exhausted stares painted a suffocating and chaotic scene. James and Emily pushed through the crowd, their faces marked by desperation. Paul needing for help at the reception desk. "Please, we need a pediatrician. Immediately, our daughter can't breathe," Emily begged, her voice breaking with fear. The receptionist looked up with indifference and instructed them to wait while she radioed for emergency assistance. Wait, even for a few seconds. That word felt like an eternity. Finally, some nurses arrived and took Olivia inside. The urgency of their movements made Emily's heart race uncontrollably as she watched her daughter disappear down the hallway, leaving the parents trapped in terrible uncertainty. Shortly after, James and Emily recognized the doctor approaching to attend to Olivia. It was the same one from that morning, Dr. Mitchell. A wave of frustration and anger swept over both of them. James looked at Emily, whose eyes brimmed with tears. "It's him," he whispered, his jaw clenched, "the same one who barely examined her this morning." Emily replied, her voice breaking with indignation. James approached the reception desk again, trying to keep his composure. "Isn't there another pediatrician who can see our daughter?" he asked firmly, though his anguish was evident. "This doctor already saw her today and was negligent. We need someone more careful, please." The receptionist shook her head and replied without any emotion, The only pediatrician on duty is Dr. Mitchell. There's no one else available. James felt a wave of helplessness crash over him, crushing him under its unbearable weight. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain the anger boiling inside him. The fear for Mia's life consumed him. "Please, God, don't let it be too late," Emily whispered, her hands clasped together in a desperate prayer, her eyes fixed on the door separating the hallway from the intensive care unit. An unbearable weight. The minutes that followed were pure torture. The echo of hurried footsteps from doctors and nurses filled the hallway, but none of them brought any news. James gripped Emily's hand so tightly that both their fingers were numb, yet neither dared to let go. That shared fear was the only thing keeping them standing finally, after what felt like an eternity. The ICU door opened. Dr. Mitchell appeared, his expression serious and tired. His lab coat was wrinkled and he held a folder in his hands. The look on his face froze the parents in their tracks. "We did everything we could, but the situation was too severe," he said bluntly. "Time of death has been declared." The word birds hit James and Emily like an avalanche. The hallway, once full of movement, seemed to close in around them, becoming a cold and deafening void. Emily collapsed to the floor, her sobs, heartbreaking her cries echoed through the halls, drawing the attention of patients and hospital staff alike. James, pale and wide-eyed, felt anger and helplessness intertwine in his chest like thorns suffocating him. The thought that his daughter's life might have been saved if the doctor had acted more responsibly consumed him. The memory of Dr. Mitchell's indifference that morning tormented him, turning his grief into a burning need for answers. James stood frozen for a few seconds, feeling the blood pounding in his temples, his fury replacing the cold shock. Finally, he broke the silence with a shout, filled with rage and despair. "If you had done your job right, my daughter could still be alive." His voice echoed through the hospital halls, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. His face was a mix of despair and uncontrollable anger this morning. "You didn't even look at her. You were glued to your damn phone," he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at the doctor. Dr. Mitchell avoided his gaze. Holding the folder like a shield, other patients and staff stopped to watch, some with expressions of sympathy, others with shock. Emily, still on the floor, continued sobbing, unable to stand. She didn't have the strength to speak. James's outburst was her only voice at that moment. The hallway was full of witnesses, but the silence between James and the doctor felt like an unspoken declaration. Negligence and loss hung heavily in the air, as James, tears streaming down his face, muttered over and over, "This shouldn't have happened, this shouldn't have happened." Dr. Mitchell finally raised his eyes, but his face remained rigid and defensive. "Sir, I understand your pain, but your daughter's condition worsened unexpectedly. We did everything we could when she arrived in critical condition." He said, his tone a mixture of formality and self-preservation, as if his words were a shield against accountability. "No, you don't understand," James replied, taking a step forward with clenched fists. "If you had paid attention, if you cared more about anything other than your phone this morning, maybe this wouldn't have happened. You left her waiting for hours with a high fever, and when you finally examined her, it was like she didn't matter. And now," he stopped, his voice breaking as he struggled to hold back his tears. "Now she's gone." Murmurs spread through the hallway and some people shook their heads in solidarity. An older nurse, watching the scene with teary eyes, looked away, painfully aware of the systemic overload and occasional negligence within the system. The silence that followed was broken by Emily, who, her voice still trembling, whispered, "Why didn't they care, James? Why did they leave her waiting so long?" Her gaze turned to the doctor this time, more sorrowful than accusatory, seeking an answer. She knew she wouldn't get Dr. Mitchell. Under the pressure of the tense atmosphere in the hallway, took a deep breath and stepped back. His expression grew even more rigid, as if he were searching for something to say, some phrase of consolation or justification to ease the weight of the accusations, but he said nothing. His silence only confirmed to everyone present that perhaps, just perhaps, James was right. The memories of that dark moment flooded James's mind with devastating force. The hours of waiting, the negligence, and the doctor's indifferent attitude replayed in his thoughts. Every painful detail amplified the whirlwind of emotions suffocating him. He closed his eyes for a moment, battling the anger and despair, feeling as though time itself had stopped, but then reality crashed into him with brutal force. There they were, back at the hospital for the third time, anxiously waiting for news about their little daughter who had unexpectedly shown signs of life during the funeral. The sound of firm, controlled footsteps in the hallway caught their attention. 2 police officers had arrived, bringing with them an air of seriousness and urgency. They approached slowly and asked for a detailed account of the events. James and Emily took deep breaths, summoning the strength to recount the sequence of events that had led to this tragedy. With a heavy, trembling voice, James began. Our daughter Olivia had a high fever and wasn't feeling well. We came to the hospital and waited more than 2 hours before being seen. He paused, trying to control the anger that seeped into his voice when they finally called us. We were seen by a young doctor, Dr. Mitchell. He spent most of the time on his phone, barely even looking at Olivia. He only examined her because Emily insisted. Then he discharged us, saying it was just a mild cold. The younger police officer listened attentively, jotting down notes while the older officer nodded, recognizing the gravity of the situation. Emily, her voice breaking, added hours later her fever spiked and she started having trouble breathing. We rushed her back and they took her straight to the ICU, but soon after they told her she didn't make it. They declared her dead. She took a deep breath, trying to hold back tears. James paused before continuing, his voice cracking with grief. But even then, they didn't get it right during the funeral. We realized she was still alive. Her skin was warm, and when I held her hand, I felt a squeeze. It was weak, but it was real. We almost buried our daughter alive. The officers exchanged disturbed glances. James continued, a mix of indignation and sadness in his tone. So we called the firefighters. They confirmed that Olivia had vital signs and brought her back to the hospital, but for some reason they wouldn't let us stay with her. I don't understand it, Emily, her gaze distant and her voice trembling, added. It was agonizing. All we wanted was to be with our daughter, but they wouldn't let us. The officers continued taking notes. Finally, the senior officer asked cautiously, how long did it take for the fur fighters to arrive? About 20 minutes. But to us it felt like an eternity. James replied, they evaluated her, confirmed her vital signs, and said she needed detailed exams. Here at the hospital since then we've been waiting for news, he added, his face filled with anguish. The officers' expressions reflected the serious IOUs-ness of the story. The senior officer sighed deeply at the end of the account. He looked at James and Emily with a serious expression before speaking. We'll file a report to ensure this situation is thoroughly investigated. We need to take statements from the doctors, nurses, and everyone involved in her care. Your testimony helps us a lot to understand the context, and now we'll do everything we can to uncover the truth. James and Emily nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over them. After several minutes of painful recounting, Dr. Mitchell finally appeared to deliver an update, interrupting the conversation with the police. His expression was neutral, but there was a clear worry in his eyes. He spoke in a low, measured tone, showing little emotion. Unfortunately, we found no vital signs in and your daughter, he announced, his voice a blend of formality and sorrow. We performed an electrocardiogram to be certain, but there was no response. I'm very sorry, we conducted all the necessary tests, but there was no cardiac activity. James and Emily looked at each other, feeling the weight of the news hit them in waves. It was as if they were hearing the devastating information for the second time, reliving a night that wouldn't end. But the firefighter said, she had a heartbeat. How can she have been alive and now no longer be? James asked, desperate for answers. His voice carried both indignation and confusion. The doctor sighed, visibly uncomfortable, and began explaining in technical terms how oximeters could sometimes detect false pulses, particularly in patients recently pronounced dead. He mentioned possible interferences that might have caused inaccurate readings, but his scientific explanations felt hollow to the grieving parents who were seeking something emotional, an answer that could fill the void they felt. What about her body? Temperature, she was warm. This doesn't make sense. Emily pressed, searching desperately for some meaning behind what had happened. The doctor hesitated, showing a rare moment of professional indecision. He seemed to care, select his words, as he tried to explain a phenomenon he himself didn't fully understand. There are cases where the body can. He paused, reflecting, to retain heat longer than expected, especially if death occurred only a few hours earlier. It's rare, but it can happen. I'm very sorry. Omark's head spun. The doctor's words seemed to contradict everything they had experienced during the funeral. Now he was facing a situation where the only thing more unsettling than the loss of his daughter was the mystery surrounding her death. It was as though reality was warping around him, leaving him without answers and with a pain deeper than he had ever imagined enduring. Emily lowered her head, holding back her tears. The cold sterility of the hospital environment made her feel miles away from her daughter, who in some inexplicable way seemed to be leaving them for the second time. James felt trapped between grief and rage, convinced that something was profoundly wrong, but in the face of the doctor's assertions, all he could do was embrace Emily and try to face together the crushing reality that their daughter was not coming back. You can see her now, the doctor said in a near whisper, perhaps fearing the impact his words might have on the couple. James and Emily exchanged glances. Exhaustion and pain etched deeply into their faces. Slowly they stood, their legs trembling and their hearts shattered, and followed the doctor down the cold hospital corridors. Each step felt like a blow, a march toward the devastating certainty that their daughter had truly left them. When the doctor stopped in front of a door, he looked at them with a solemn expression, as though preparing them for what they were about to see. He pushed the door open, slowly revealing the small body of their baby on a stretcher, covered by a thin white sheet that left her tiny arms and face exposed. James and Emily stepped forward hesitantly, their gazes falling on the scene that would remain etched in their minds forever. The baby lay with her arms stretched out in a strikingly symmetrical position. Her delicate, fragile limbs seemed to reach out in a silent plea for an embrace. The white sheet covering her only deepened that impression, as if she were asking for one last touch, one final comfort before leaving her small face. Bore a serene expression, but to the tormented eyes of James and Emily, there was an indescribable trace of sorrow in those still features. It was as if she carried a silent grief with her, an anguish that could never be expressed. Her tiny lips were lightly parted, giving the impression she was about to cry, and her closed eyes exuded a disturbing peace, a serenity that seemed to contradict all the agony of the moment. Emily let out a choked sob, unable to contain the pain overwhelming her heart. She moved closer to the stretcher, leaning over to touch her daughter's tiny hand. The sensation of her skin, now cold and rigid, was a jarring shock to her soul, a brutal contrast to the warmth she had felt during the funeral, a searing reminder of the moment when there had still been a spark of hope, a promise of life. James stood frozen, his gaze fixed on his daughter's lifeless form. Her outstretched arms, as if reaching for the void, seemed to cry out to him, as though she had spent her final moments, waiting for a comfort that never came. Guilt and helplessness swirled in his mind, turning every second in that room into silent torture. He took a step forward, moving closer to Emily, and the two stood together, looking at their daughter in her final rest. James extended his hand to touch the baby's face gently, brushing his fingers over her pale, cold skin. His heart screamed silently, as if hoping against all reason that she would open her eyes, that some inexplicable miracle would bring back the spark of life. It's like she's asking for a hug. James, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. James nodded, but no words could express the avalanche of emotions consuming him. He leaned over his daughter, his lips trembling as they neared her tiny face, and left a soft kiss on her forehead. It was a simple gesture, a mix of farewell and love, laden with all his pain and grief. With the white cloth draped over the baby's small body, she looked almost sacred, a blend of purity and tragedy. Her delicate arms, outstretched in a posture reminiscent of Christ, left a profound impression, a final gesture of innocence amidst so much suffering. The contrast between the fragility of her interrupted life and the weight of the scene was overwhelming, as if her position was a silent plea to the world, a question without an answer about the brevity and injustice of life. As the couple stood there immersed in their sorrow, the last remnants of hope faded. They had experienced a second farewell, one that felt even more painful because it carried with it the definitive certainty that their daughter would not return. Preparations for the second funeral. Once again, the funeral home had to be prepared. Flowers were refreshed and arranged around the small white coffin, flickering. Candles cast trembling shadows on the walls, creating a somber and solemn atmosphere. James and Emily sat once more beside their daughter's body, surrounded by the same friends and family who had been with them during the first funeral this time. However, the atmosphere was different. The doubt and astonishment that had previously filled the air had been replaced by a heavy silence, where sorrow mingled with a lingering sense of something inexplicable. The faces of the relatives and friends marked by grief looked at the couple with a mix of compassion, concern, and confusion. What had happened at the hospital? No one seemed able to explain it clearly for many present. The sequence of events seemed absurd, almost unbelievable, as if life had turned into an unending nightmare. Emily kept her eyes fixed on her daughter's small body, her thoughts wandering between memories and unanswered questions. She felt the weight of the past hours pressing down on her shoulders, the uncertainty tormenting her mind since the moment her daughter had been taken from the first funeral. The doctor's words echoed in her head, each technical explanation feeling hollow, almost cold, from someone who should have shown more empathy for the life of a child. It all happened so quickly, James, Emily murmured as James remained silent beside her. Staring at the coffin, he didn't respond. He simply took Emily's hand and held it firmly. James felt a strange sense of emptiness, as if all the pain he carried was tinged with a mixture of indignation and distrust for him. This second death, this second farewell felt cruelly unreal. It was as if he were being forced to endure a double grief, an unending sorrow, where his emotions tangled unbearably one by one. Friends and family approached, again to say their goodbyes, touching the small coffin with gestures of tenderness and reverence. This time, There were no doubts or murmurs about the baby's body temperature. Everyone had painfully understood that this departure was final, yet the unease lingered, a sense that something was terribly wrong, that there were unanswered questions and an incomplete story. When the last relative had said their goodbyes, the priest approached, murmuring a quiet prayer. He raised his hands over the coffin and traced a sign of blessing, asking God to receive the baby's soul. James and Emily bowed their heads, seeking solace in the priest's words, but the peace they sought seemed increasingly elusive, slipping from their grasp and leaving behind only a shadow of doubt. After the burial, friends and family began to disperse, slowly leaving the couple alone beside the freshly covered grave, surrounded by flowers that exuded a melancholy scent. James looked at Emily, his expression tense and somber. "We need answers, Emily," he said quietly, but with a determination she had never seen in him before. "We can't accept this. Not like this." Emily nodded, her gaze filled with sadness and understanding. She knew her husband was right. They had trusted the hospital to save their daughter's life, and now all that remained were painful questions and a void that refused to be filled. "I feel the same, James," she replied, her voice breaking. "Something inside me can't accept what they told us. The explanations. None of it makes sense." They looked at each other, a growing resolve taking root in their hearts. This was no longer just about grief, it was about their right to know what had truly happened. Why had their baby shown signs of life during the funeral? What had happened in the hospital while they were kept at a distance, unable to be with her, during what was supposed to be her final moments? And why, after so much mystery, were they forced to endure a second farewell without clear answers? That same night, exhausted and emotionally devastated, James and Emily decided they needed help. They knew fighting for justice would require more resources than they had. However, when the story of little Mir began to spread throughout the city, sparking outrage and support, a kind-hearted and highly regarded attorney offered to represent them for free. "I can't ignore your pain," the lawyer said during their meeting. "I will help you seek the truth and justice." The impact of the case was immediate when Emia's story, declared dead twice, reached the media. The community responded with a mix of shock and outrage. Local news outlets, followed by national ones, covered every detail, from the parents' emotional testimonies to the initial findings of the investigation. The city, which had initially observed the situation with apprehension, united in an act of solidarity and protest. Groups of neighbors, friends, and supporters gathered outside the hospital wearing white t-shirts with Olivia's image and the words, "Justice for Mir" signs with slogans appeared, and a chorus of voices echoed through the streets. "Mitchell must go. Justice now. Olivia lives on in our fight." The rhythmic, energetic chants filled the air, creating an atmosphere of unity and determination. The protest and media coverage pressured the hospital administration into action. In an official statement, they announced that Dr. Gia would be temporarily suspended while the investigation was completed. However, that announcement did not quell the outrage. Protests continued, and the presence of reporters and cameras ensured the case would not be forgotten. The lawyer, determined to help James and Emily, began a meticulous investigation. She collected all medical documents and case records, requested patient histories and internal communications from the hospital, and gathered key testimonies, including statements from the firefighters who confirmed MEA's vital signs and the pharmacist who first detected that the child was alive. The attorney also obtained security camera footage from the hospital, which revealed the lack of urgency in Dr. Mitchell's handling of Olivia's case. When the day of the trial arrived, the tension was palpable. James and Emily sat in the front row, their faces etched with anticipation and sorrow across the room. Dr. Mitchell sat with his head bowed, pale and visibly shaken. The courtroom was packed with people who had followed every stage of the case. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd whenever the doctor raised his eyes toward them. Outside, the cries for justice continued to echo, while inside the courtroom the evidence and testimonies began to unravel the truth behind the tragedy. The lead expert presented the investigation's findings, detailing all the failures uncovered through a thorough review of medical records, internal communications, and gathered testimonies. "It is clear that there was severe negligence and ethical breaches in the care provided to Olivia Andrade," the expert declared, their grave voice resonating in the courtroom. Emily held James's hand as silent tears streamed down her face. The lawyer remained vigilant, awaiting the verdict that would finally bring some resolution to the couple's struggle. Dr. Mitchell neglected his duty as a physician by failing to conduct a comprehensive evaluation and by becoming distracted with electronic devices which compromised the correct diagnosis of the patient. This negligence worsened Meyer's condition, leading to the tragedy. "We all know," the expert continued, the judge looked sternly at the doctor before delivering his sentence based on the evidence and the violations of the medical ethics code. Dr. Mitchell Roberto's medical license is permanently revoked. He is prohibited from practicing medicine and will face criminal charges for negligence and malpractice. Furthermore, the hospital is ordered to compensate Olivia's family for moral and material damages. The announcement triggered a wave of reactions. People in the courtroom began to applaud, some with tears in their eyes, while others loudly booed. The doctor outside the crowd erupted in shouts of victory and relief. Mitchell must go, justice for Olivia, they chanted with even greater intensity. When Dr. Mitchell left the courthouse under escort, he was met by an enraged community. Tomatoes and eggs flew in his direction as he tried to shield himself, his face contorted with shame and fear. The escort acted quickly to control the crowd and ensure his safety, but the public display of outrage made it clear that the community neither forgot nor forgave what had happened. James and Emily walked out of the courthouse together, exhausted, but with a newfound sense of relief. The attorney accompanied them, her face reflecting quiet pride for the hard-fought victory. The couple paused in front of the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and reporters who had followed their fight from the beginning. Emily turned to the attorney, her eyes still glistening with tears. "We have no words to thank you for everything you've done for us," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You gave us hope when no one else believed." James nodded, visibly moved. "We know you chose to help us without asking for anything in return, but it's only fair that your dedication and determination are recognized. We want you to accept a portion of the settlement as payment for your fees. It's the least we can do for everything you've done for our family." The attorney, who had initially offered to work pro bono, smiled, her eyes shining. She was honored to have represented such an important cause. "I deeply appreciate your generosity, but the real credit goes to you. Your strength and courage made all this possible," she replied, her voice slightly breaking. "Still, I will accept the gesture with gratitude, not just for myself, but to help other families seek justice in the future." Emily took James's hand, and the three shared a look that spoke volumes. The attorney knew that more than a legal victory, this case was a milestone in preventing other families from facing the loss of a loved one so unjustly. "This victory belongs to Olivia," she concluded, her tone reflecting a sense of fulfilled duty. "May her story serve as an example and protection for other children." With the settlement funds, James and Emily ensured the attorney's fees were paid, a gesture that demonstrated not only gratitude, but recognition of the solidarity and effort she had devoted to their cause. They knew that without her help, the truth about Olivia might have remained buried forever. The couple looked to the sky, feeling that despite the pain they would always carry, their daughter's memory would serve as a beacon of justice and hope for others. The story of little Mia is not just a portrait of a family's pain, but also a call to reflect on the responsibility of those who have sworn to protect lives based on true events. This tragedy reminds us that lack of preparation and absence of empathy can cost precious lives, like that of a little girl with a whole future ahead of her. Olivia invites us to consider the importance of a healthcare system committed to dignity and human care. How many more Myers must suffer before real changes are made? This story exposes not just individual errors, but also the systemic failures that too often prioritize numbers and processes over people. May Olivia's story be both a wake-up call and a source of inspiration. Let it drive us to demand greater humanity from those who work in healthcare, to report negligence, and to support families who, like Olivia's parents, turn their pain into strength to fight for justice and change. Olivia now lives on in the memory of all who believe that life should always be treated as the most valuable gift. May her brief time in this world serve as a catalyst for transformation, and may her light continue to shine in every effort to ensure no other family endures the same suffering.